Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Gulbranson. My role here in the NorCal ELC is a professional learning director. I'm really happy to see everybody here today. I hope you enjoyed the morning as much as I did. I thought that was fantastic. Tomorrow, I'm going to be talking a little bit to new team participants to add a little bit more context to the structure that Kim and Kenny were just referring to. So to really quickly answer your question, Al, regional PLCs have not been divvied up yet. So we will announce that and who your region's coach will be when we come back in fall. But I'll be given tomorrow morning. So to move into our afternoon session, I'm really excited to talk about our two keynote speakers. They are colleagues of mine at CSU Chico, Dr. Rebecca Justeson and Dr. Jamie Gunderson. They are here today to talk to us about healing-centered teaching, supporting students and self. There's a little bit more of a description on the resource page regarding what they're going to be talking about. So rather than reading it to you, I'm going to let you pull that up and look at it if you'd like to do that. But again, these are my colleagues who I think very highly of. They are fantastic educators. Rebecca is the director of the School of Education, and Jamie is the program coordinator for the class grant, and she was just recently awarded the award for most innovative pedagogy from the College of Communication and Education. So congratulations to Jamie. And I'd like to tell you more about Rebecca since she's my boss, but I'm going to let them add a little bit more context as they start. So Rebecca and Jamie, the floor is yours.
Okay, welcome. And we wanted to thank you all for coming. I know that this is challenging when, there we go, I can see it. I wanted to say, I know this is challenging being virtual. Some of you look more lively than others, so we're gonna do our best to make it a little bit lively. I just wanna note we're here together because we noticed that if we bounce off each other on Zoom, it was this delay that we weren't comfortable with. So you have both of us kind of squinched into a screen today. And I just want to say hello to some of, we've noticed looking through the list of participants that we have former students, probably more for me because I'm getting old, and then great colleagues in the room. So thank you for just being here. We really appreciate it. We want to say that we have some expertise with these topics, and we're going to share what that is in a moment, but we definitely don't consider ourselves experts here. There are many experts in this room, and I can see it as we go through the list of you all here. So we're hoping to open this up to a discussion at various points in our talk today. And I just want to note that the link to our presentation has just been put in the chat, so you can follow along with us as we go through this. So, whoops, can you, yeah, there we go. So having said that, we're going to tell you a little bit about who we are, and then we're going to tell you a little bit about why we're here talking about this topic. So I'm Rebecca Justeson, and I'm the director of the School of Education. And I assumed this role right at the beginning of the year of the campfire. And I thought just the morning, I literally had the thought the morning I went to work on November 8th that, you know, I might be able to get this shtick down working as director. And I got into the office, and a lot of our staff had already left because they had lost their homes. So that launched a very challenging year. And then we rolled into obviously the global pandemic with COVID. So it's been an interesting 3 years. Prior to being director, I've worked in a variety of teacher preparation programs, the RTR program, the tri-placement program, some alternative pathways, the multiple subject program. And then prior to that, I taught at schools serving underserved students for 12 years.
And I'm Jamie Gunderson, and I come to you from Las Vegas, Nevada. This is my third year at Chico State, so I'm kind of a newer faculty member, if you will, or junior faculty. But I come from a long line of teaching. So I was a special educator in Las Vegas, Nevada for many years at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. I focused my teaching on students with mild to moderate and moderate severe disabilities. And as part of that, my time in Clark County or Las Vegas, I was also an assistive technologist, wherein I focused on access and equity in terms of technology for students who had special needs and adapting and modifying that technology. And then in my last couple of years with that school district, I was an administrator charged with recruiting special education teachers. And this was for the nation's 5th largest school district. So my quota to bring in teachers was like 1,000 teachers a year. It was crazy. But really, as I was kind of growing in the ranks of education, I was also pursuing my research in my master's and PhD program. And I got really excited and passionate about universal design for learning, this idea of meeting all learners and providing access to all. And so I wanted to really further my knowledge and learn more about UDL, but also share that knowledge with future pre-service educators. So right now I am so lucky to be at the university as an assistant professor, wherein I work with pre-service educators to prepare them for their first years of teaching. And then I also am the lead fellow for the Office of Faculty Development at Chico State, wherein I get the opportunity to work with faculty and staff to promote better learning and teaching on the campus. So thank you for allowing us to be here today.
Okay, so we're going to tell you a little bit about why we're talking to you on this topic, and we're doing this purposefully. We don't want to drone on and on about ourselves. We want to sort of model a strategy and tell you a little bit about how we came to this work. So I spent some time studying positive psychology at the University of Pennsylvania with Marty Seligman, and Marty Seligman started a branch of psychology called positive psychology, which is sort of the science-based study of human flourishing. And as a part of that work, I ironically focused on trauma and how to recover from trauma and resilience as a part of that process. And in that experience, I interviewed Holocaust survivors in their 80s and 90s in North Miami Beach, Florida. I interviewed, I don't know if you recall the Andes crash actually in 1972 in the Andes. It was a rugby team that crashed, and not all of them lived, and they ate some of the dead bodies to survive. And then a couple of them walked out of the Andes to find help. And so I interviewed the survivors, many of the survivors from that experience. And then I worked for 5 years with the Army on their comprehensive soldier and family fitness, worked with non-commissioned officers, leaders, and eventually combat veterans as a part of that work. And that, honestly, probably became interested in all of that just as a result of a challenging childhood myself, and then had a period of time in my late teens, early 20s, characterized by a lot of profound loss. So I actually lost 5 people in 5 years, and 2 of them were very, very close to me. So it was a very challenging time.
All right, and so my story begins in 2018, the summer of 2018. My husband and I, like I said, we were just really excited to pursue different professional opportunities. I really wanted to work with pre-service educators, and I got a job at Chico State. So my husband and I, not knowing much, and I had never lived anywhere else before, but we decided to move to Paradise in the summer of 2018. And a few months later, we lost everything. And that was jarring. It was very difficult. But I think the most difficult thing for me was I was one of the people who was stuck up there trying to drive out of the fire through flames for hours. And I really wasn't sure I was going to make it through that at all. And I certainly wasn't sure that anybody behind me could make it as well. And when I did finally drive out of the fire after a few hours, I was just so grateful to make it out. And I feel like I never stopped running from that point. So I was constantly just trying to get my life back together, keep my professional career in order, maintain my mental well-being. But unfortunately, after a few months of really trying to stay positive and keep moving forward, my body kind of started keeping the score. And so over the ensuing months, I started to have these very weird physical symptoms. Things like I would be in my office, or I would be standing in front of my students teaching, and I would get this intense tingle all over my body. In some of the worst moments, I would kind of black out from the outside in. I would lose my vision, or have like struggle breathing, or just feel like really panicked and upset. I also suffered a lot after the fire with nightmares, night terrors I would wake up in the middle of the night and I would just have this like intense heat on my arm, and just be really like upset. And I think it was because like as I was driving out, the flames and the heat of the flames coming through my window was just like a lot for me to take in physically. And so these things started happening to me on not a daily basis, but pretty regular. I was getting, if I could finally fall asleep, I would have nightmares, or I would be up all night with insomnia. I started to get like really bad pain in my jaw, struggle to be able to chew, talk for long periods of time, because I noticed I was so stressed and clenching my teeth, even in my sleep, in my day-to-day. And I was just really in a bad emotional way. And I have to tell you, I hate talking about this and it gets me a little verklempt, but it got to the point that the idea for me of not waking up seemed a bit easier than the idea of taking on the day. And in my most desperate moment, I finally broke down and I called the Crisis Hotline. And in that day, in that moment, somebody was there to pick up the phone, to talk to me, to calm me down, and then to connect me immediately to resources. And on that same day, I was connected to somebody who was able to help support me and kind of get me on a journey to understand what was happening within me, and B, take actions to kind of neutralize and metabolize that and really focus on my well-being. But I come to you to tell you that. I don't want you to feel bad for me, anything like that. I just want to share with you that on this journey that I've been on, and I'm going to continue to be on this journey probably for the rest of my life, to make sure that I'm always waking up with a positive mindset and doing what I can to metabolize my stress and trauma moving forward. But I learned so many strategies to neutralize stress, and I'm really excited to share those with others, especially teachers, because I really feel that many of the tools that I've learned in my experience can have such immense positive effects on teaching and learning if we just teach our students how to use these same tools. So hopefully my experience today will bring a little bit of something extra to what we're going to share with you. And then I just kind of we're going to do a little exercise. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but we always kind of want to share our authentic stories. And then I want to do what's called a positive reframe. So I'm going to positively reframe Rebecca's narrative. So because of her struggles and her interest in positive psychology, luckily for me, and I can speak only for me, that I really will say that her expertise, her knowledge was very helpful, because she was a very compassionate leader during a time where a lot of people in my department were struggling to survive. And most specifically, when I put myself in these shoes, I was really supported by Rebecca, in that she was one of the first people to that I opened up to about some of my symptoms and some of the things that I was experiencing day to day. And the first thing that she told me is that I was normal, because I felt like I was crazy. Mm-hmm. And that my reaction was just a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. She kind of started me on the journey to understand like how to support myself, how to help myself. And as I got on that journey, I realized I kind of hate this, but I was diagnosed with the trifecta of fun. So PTSD, depression, and anxiety. And while that was really difficult for me to metabolize, I feel like acknowledging that I was struggling with those things ultimately led me to be able to tame that. Some people call it name it to tame it, but it let me be able to kind of recognize and tame that, taking action to support my well-being.
And if I were to positively reframe Jamie's story, which sounds very challenging, and it was very challenging, I would say that as I observed her, I saw a person who was having a normal pattern of reaction to something very, very challenging, to a very abnormal set of events. And I saw her with, sort of great determination to move forward, and with great curiosity about what was occurring with her, and a great desire to get better, and a great desire to figure it out, to really understand what she was experiencing, and then a great desire to give back to teachers and students once she did understand it. So that's what I would say about that as a positive reframe. Okay, so today we have a few simple broad goals of what we want to talk about. We want to do a little more definition of trauma and resilience and the relationship between them, just because we think when we have, language to talk about things, which I know everybody in this room does, but maybe get a little deeper with it, it helps us. Examine the impacts of stress on learning, identify healing-centered practices, discuss how to support students in crisis, look at the impacts of stress on teaching and the importance of self-care, which is important, and explore behaviors that support resilience and post-traumatic growth. So this conversation, we feel is important, but one of the things we just want to do is sort of tell you why we think it's important. So in the schools and in our society, we have sort of terms that are getting more attention these days. And these terms are things like collective trauma or historical trauma or intergenerational trauma. And I just want to give a little shout out to them. So when we're talking about collective trauma, we're talking about trauma experienced by a group, right? So either a response to like a one-time event, like a natural disaster, for example, the campfire, or a human disaster, a shooting or some event like that. And then, and then the other piece is an ongoing collective physical or emotional injury. So things like race-based stress would fall under collective trauma. Extreme poverty or high crime environments, spending a lot of time in those environments are collective trauma experiences. When we talk about historical trauma, which is actually getting, some traction right now, we're talking about things like the Holocaust. We're talking about slavery. We're talking about 9/11. We're talking about those experiences that were traumatic, that were they're usually collective, and they're historical, so shared by many people on a part of our history that may still be having an impact on people. And then intergenerational trauma, we're usually talking about those family patterns that are transmitted down through the families, primarily through parenting, and are creating situations where individuals are sort of unknowingly, unwittingly passing down circumstances and problems, ways of being in the world, identities that set them up for consequences that may not be productive, might set them up for mental health risks, physical health risks, sort of replicating traumas of the past, and those sort of things. And they do that, these are sort of intergenerationally transmitted through things like epigenetics, which is a really interesting sort of concept where genes are expressed through non-genetic changes. This is the way that I understand that. And I'll give some examples of that. We'll give some examples of that in a bit. And things like dysfunctional sort of bonds and relationships in families. Trauma bonds is a term that we hear, people who sort of connect to each other and form relationships to each other in really dysfunctional ways, and they might not realize they're dysfunctional. So these are always the situations where you hear people say, why don't they just do it differently? Why don't they just get out? Why don't they just leave? And the truth about that is because it's so ingrained in what normalcy looks like for a group of individuals that it's not that simple. A couple examples, I guess. One example is I just read a study about female sexual abuse survivors, and they had been individuals who had vowed that they would absolutely spot people being predatory with their children, without a doubt. They said, I would absolutely catch it. I would never overlook it. My child will not be abused as I was abused. And what the study actually found, and I'm just glancing at my notes here, was that those children actually had a greater possibility of being abused because of the history sort of reinforced an atmosphere of detachment and sort of disassociation that that individual didn't recognize. And so that would be to the great horror of those mothers, right? Those mothers did not recognize that, that they would be, their history would set them up in ways to have a blind spot that they didn't see. So these sort of impacts are what we're talking about when we talk about these terms: collective trauma, intergenerational trauma, historical trauma. And we could go on forever, but we won't. And then we want to kind of talk about trauma effects on individuals. So when we talk about that, we're usually talking about things like post-traumatic stress, right? Which is sort of an acute syndrome of symptoms, much like Jamie described: anxiety, feelings of helplessness, re-experiencing physical symptoms, that sort of thing related to a traumatic event. And then we have a couple more terms that get thrown around a lot. So we just kind of want to define them. Complex trauma being one. Judith Herman, who did work on trauma in the 80s, talked a lot about PTSD. And one of the things she defined was sort of a single event trauma being one event, but complex trauma being multiple events that sort of tend to be ongoing, repeating patterns of either abuse and neglect is common, chronic stress, experiences where you sort of re-experience trauma being referred to as complex trauma. And then to take it one step further, developmental trauma is trauma that happens during the, at a critical point in the lifespan. And usually these are things like abuse and neglect, or sort of patterns of abuse that happen when children are young, that really impact them. So in 1998, that all this sort of definition to sort of lead us into our current attention to this topic, which I know ACEs are now sort of like a term tossed around. We're all very familiar with ACEs, but this sort of started with a landmark study in 1998. It was a partnership between the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente. They did a study of 17,000 individuals. And basically what they found was that there was a relationship between the breadth of exposure to abuse or household dysfunction during childhood to multiple risk factors leading to death in adulthood. And so that got everybody's attention, that actual risk factors in childhood could lead to an increased rate of death in adulthood. And it got everybody wondering why. And so that's sort of the study that got us all taking seriously that toxic stress can really have a compelling impact on us. And so now we're talking about that. I will fast forward a bit to folks are now starting to focus on protective childhood experiences, or they're calling them protective and compensatory childhood experiences. And we'll get more into that when we talk about post-traumatic growth. But
so the impact of this 1998 study is still with us, right? And what's really cool about California, one of the things I love about transitioning from Nevada to California is like, we're super aware, we're super on top of things here. And so if you haven't already heard, which I'm sure you have, there is a California ACEs Aware initiative. And this initiative has two goals. Number one, it's to reduce the ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, and toxic stress by 1/2 in one generation. So like Rebecca talked about, that intergenerational trauma, we're really trying with this movement to stop that cycle. And then the second kind of goal of that movement is for folks to understand their own ACEs score, to know, like I said at the beginning when I kind of shared my story, to kind of like name and recognize the things that you're bringing to the table, can also be a way to kind of really target some areas of improvement for growth. And so we encourage everybody as part of this initiative to also know their ACEs number. But I want to just kind of take it to so this ACEs Aware movement is really, right now, it's kind of in the health sector. We know a little bit about education, it's moving in this direction, but really we're really looking at the impacts in the health sector. So I want to just kind of give you kind of a rundown on some of the health consequences of adverse childhood experiences. So any person with any ACE has an increased risk for 9 to 10 of the leading causes of death. These are things like congestive heart failure, cancer, stroke, that sort of thing. But with people with 4 or more ACEs, and here's pretty sobering statistics, are 38 times more likely to attempt suicide, 11 times likely to have Alzheimer's or dementia, 3 times more likely to have chronic respiratory disease, 2 times more likely to suffer from stroke, cancer, or heart disease, and 1.5 times more likely to have diabetes. What's really sad is people with 6 or more ACEs, the life expectancy is 19 years on average shorter than people with none. And that was really concerning to me because my ACE score is a 7.
Yeah, and we were just talking about this. I think mine is a 6 or a 7. So we were wanting to reclaim those 19 years.
Yeah, I don't want to lose those
Jesus.
19 years. No, thank you. So moving on.
So we're just going to just really quickly get a little more foundation on common language, and then we're going to hear from you. So resilience, just kind of so we're all kind of talking the same language. Resilience, when we use that term, we're referring the capacity to recover or bounce back from difficulty or adversity. And not just that piece, but also to grow and thrive in the face of challenges. So to maybe reach out for new experiences, to put ourselves at risk, to try new things. Anne Maston did some important work on this on the island of Kauai, actually with children. And she said that resilience or a resilient response is a normal response to adversity. And when it happens appropriately and it happens well, it looks like ordinary magic. So it's magical, but it's actually quite ordinary. When it goes astray or we have children low on resilience, that's a different thing. But resilience at its best is ordinary magic. Life equals adversity. So, being resilient builds our well-being and our happiness because we do have to overcome things daily. And usually we're referring to things like inner resources or mental toughness. There's a lot of discussion in, the resilience literature about whether your bounce back has to happen quickly or not. Some say yes, some say no. Some say if it's not pretty quick, it's not a resilient response, but I'm just highlighting that. I don't really have the answer there. And so let me just move this over.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about, so then trauma, the sort of the difference here with trauma. So resilience is a little bit more daily struggles, right? Daily hassles, things that challenge us. We want to be able to meet them head on and meet them with a degree of resilience. Trauma, I always say when there's trauma, all bets are off. I mean, trauma looks a lot of different ways and people respond a lot of different ways based on who they are and what the characteristics of the experience were. But it's defined as an individual's response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms their ability to cope. So I like this definition I just heard, that it's any event or ongoing experience with a significant impact on the survival or animal part of the brain. So that part of the brain that is more, automatic and outside of our control, and it just, there's an impact to it. Anything that overwhelms our resources to cope. It can be emotional or physical. There's usually an acute trauma phase where things are just, very, very stressful. It's that crisis period. And then there's more long-term reactions, PTSD, some of that complicated trauma reactions that take time. But the good news is that there's a significant amount of research to show that post-traumatic growth, and we're going to talk about this in a bit, is actually possible. Tedeschi and Calhoun were the first folks that talked about this. They actually coined the term in 1995, and they're talking about growing through traumatic experiences, and we'll talk more, like I said. The relationship between the two is that resilience is a protective factor for trauma. So if you have a degree of resilience, it will serve you well when you encounter something very, very difficult. Just the strength, your cognitive style that is related to resilience, flexibility in the way you respond to problems, patterns of competence or sense of self-efficacy, all of those things can moderate that relationship between trauma exposure and long-term negative outcomes. So, it decreases your chances of becoming, depressed or have PTSD that will not remit over time, or something more permanent. So it just helps you to get over it eventually. And I will say with trauma, the time course is always more complicated than you think. I mean, that's what I generally think. You can't really dictate the time course. I think we all know this. And especially if there's this sort of ongoing complex and developmental trauma, sometimes it's lifelong strategies that we need in place. So as Al Roker says, what's happening in your neck of the woods? We know a lot's been going on in our community, in our world, with resilience and trauma. And right now we're going to ask, the slide disappeared on me. Here we go.
Sorry.
What have you noticed about your students' stress over the past year? What are their needs and struggles? And we have a Jamboard here for you. And we're going to ask Jamie, you take it away. This is her jam. The
Yes.
Jamboard
So
is her
what
jam.
we want to hear from you. We kind of talked a little bit about what trauma is, what stress is, and we're going to break it down in terms of what's happening in the brain and how it impacts learning and teaching. But for a moment, if you guys could all, I posted the link in the chat, or if you're following along with the slides, you can go ahead and bump on there too. If you follow along with me, to post on the Jamboard, if you've never done so before, just find this cute little sticky note feature here. Oh, that's not it. Way to click on the wrong thing, Jamer. Okay, right here, sticky note. You can select your color and just type in and then click save, and it will post your sticky note onto the Jamboard. We'll give you just about 2 to 3 minutes to think about what you've noticed about students' stress and struggles over the past year. Okay, it looks like there are too many people on the Jamboard. I didn't know that was even a thing. What we could do.
People go in and put their notes and then log out of the Jamboard. We can all cycle through.
Okay, perfect. That's what I'm
Awesome.
seeing, because I'm seeing them all fly in. Yeah.
Another option too, if you're interested and you want to post your notes in the chat, we can also monitor that as well.
I'm seeing lots and lots of comments about lack of connection, loneliness, sadness, low engagement. Increases of fear and anxiety, I also think might be related to the decrease in putting yourself out there. You know, the decreased need to have to go and face situations. Gosh, isolated.
There's some in the chat as well. We have lots of anxiety.
Craving connection. Motivation is another one.
Afraid to return to class. Yeah, our students are dealing with a lot.
I was gonna say, so I'm trying to look behind them. But yeah, a lot more anxiety, low resilience. Social and group dynamics, yes.
Higher levels of motivational issues, yes. We're gonna be able to break that down in the brain and talk about why.
It is literally like there's 4 comments stated in a variety of ways.
Over and over,
yeah.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much for jumping on that Jamboard. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. But let's talk about what's happening when our students are stressing out in the brain. And so this stuff geeks me out. I get super excited. So just go with me. If I go a little too fast, just tell me to slow down, because I love me some brain. All right, so I believe that it is important for educators to understand how stress impacts learning. While our knowledge of the learning brain is evolving, advances in neuroscience and technology and research have expanded our understanding. So very generally speaking, and if you can see, I'll do my little annotate here, do a little spotlight. So right here, you can, oh, go back, sorry. So right here, as I put my cursor, you can see I'm up at the top kind of left-hand part of the screen. So very generally speaking, our brains are kind of, if you think about it, in kind of divided into 3 different regions. So we have our reptilian piece of the brain, which is our oldest and most primitive part of the brain. It controls our automatic functions like breathing, heartbeat, digestion. And it also houses this really cool, what I like to call the scanner feature of our brain, which is called the reticulating activating system. It's called the RAS. I call it the RAS. And what this does is we unconsciously really have no control over, is our brains are just scanning constantly, 100% of the time, 24/7, for any perceived threat or stress. And so in the reptilian brain, if that RAS is activated, it automatically tells these functions and organs in the limbic brain to release hormones, either for to enhance our alertness, to enhance our ability to, get out of a situation we need to get out of. But at the same token, these hormones could sometimes be positive. So if we're really interested in something, this might enhance our motivation. But essentially, the reptilian and the limbic piece of the brain work in conjunction, right? We don't really control a lot of the reptilian and limbic function, but we know that they're related. So I'm going to give you a little bit more about the limbic section, because this is really the part of the brain that's responsible for emotion. And our limbic region is essentially also the area that we use to regulate our behavior. And it also houses our memory and background knowledge. So that's really important to know. A couple of key organisms, the thalamus, which is this little green dot here. This is where we process the sensory information from that RAS, that brain scanning function or organelle in the reptilian brain that I talked about. And this will tell the rest of our brain what to do. So if we are perceiving threat, the thalamus will start to send chemicals and electrical impulses to get our brains to respond. And so this is really great, because this helped protect us for so long as our human species evolved. Like, this is the reason that if we see a snake in the grass, we automatically jump back, because our reptilian and our limbic brains are doing that automatically for us. Another piece of the limbic brain is this yellow piece, which is called the hippocampus. This houses our memory, background knowledge, and information from past experiences, which becomes really important when we have students who have experiences of trauma. That lives here in the limbic, which is associated with our emotion. And then lastly, we have this amygdala. It looks kind of like a bean, and it reacts to stimuli instantaneously by signaling the release of hormones when stress or threat is perceived. So essentially, we have our reptilian piece, which is kind of focused on survival, but also scanning our environment. And then we have the limbic for emotion. And then we get into the neocortex. So all of this, the reptilian and limbic brain, have to be kind of in sync and engaged and motivated in a calm and happy presence in order for learning to happen in the neocortex. So this is where I really, really geek out. I love to talk about the learning and what it looks like in the brain. So I'm going to jump down here into this section where we see the neuron. And I'm going to talk to you about what exactly learning is in the brain. And so this is really cool. So essentially we have the neocortex, right, which is up at the top. And this is responsible for imagination, thinking, planning, learning. And it has an endless capacity, the neocortex, to wire itself. And by wiring itself, I mean, down here at the cellular level, we have 100 billion neurons in our brains. That's an estimate, but pretty accurate one. 100 billion, right? That's a lot. And then each one of these neurons, when we're learning something new, it communicates to other neurons. So these neurons are specialized cells in our brain that process information. When we're learning something new, we're experiencing something new, we're stimulated, our neurons just start communicating to one another using chemical and electrical impulses. We call this firing and wiring. And this firing and wiring of neurons creates connections that form neural pathways, which allow our brains to process information and connect information to our prior knowledge. I know the teachers in the room will know the word schema, right? So this is essentially our schema. This is how we build schema at the cellular level. What's super duper cool about this, and this will help you kind of understand this idea and this concept of neurodiversity, is that any one of our neurons, right, 100 billion of them, can connect to thousands upon thousands of other neurons. I've read research anywhere between 4,000 and 12,000 connections. But thousands and thousands of these little hundreds of billions of cells connecting to other cells in the brain to form those neural pathways. What's really cool is when a neural pathway is formed, we've connected prior information with new knowledge. And the more that we use that knowledge or recall that knowledge, the stronger those connections get. This is a process called myelination, but I'm not going to geek out on you wholly. I'll just go with the connectome. I'll tell you a little bit more about neurodiversity and how it all comes together. So essentially, when we have these neurons connect to other neurons, like I said, 100 billion neurons can all have thousands upon thousands of connections. That's essentially, I would say, hundreds of trillions of neural pathways. And if we want to break this down and get a little geeky with science, I really love space. And so if you think about the amount of neurons that you have, neuropathic connections in your brain, you have more neuropathic connections in your brain than there are 1,000-fold the stars in the Milky Way galaxy. That is 1,000 Milky Way galaxies. So for those of you who are into brains and space or nerdy like me, that just geeks me out. So essentially those trillions and trillions of connections form our connectomes. And because of just the vast number of those connections and how they're made and how we experience and perceive things, nobody's connectome can be the same as somebody else's. Nobody can perceive everything the same. Nobody can experience things the same. Nobody learns the same. We are essentially, as humans, very neurodiverse. And this connectome kind of shares that. So I likened it to this idea of that learning is as unique as a fingerprint. And that, when I put my UDL hat on, we already know that. That's very established in the Universal Design for Learning literature. What's really cool is, though the connectomes differ, right? The ways in which we learn, how we create these neural pathways are pretty consistent across humans. And what's really great is Universal Design for Learning breaks this down into kind of a learning process. And the goal of this process is to get educators thinking about activating all different types of areas or regions in the brain to support learning. So I want to kind of take it there for you and just kind of pull or highlight a couple of really cool features. So once you understand like how neural pathways are made, how we kind of connect knowledge to knowledge in the brain, we start to see these larger systems, right? The affective network, which looks a lot like our limbic network, right? We'll talk about that in a moment. And that is a part of what we want to engage. We want to use this kind of midbrain, if you will, to hook our students, get them interested, get them excited about learning. We're using their emotion, their positive emotions, to get them hooked on what we're about to teach them. And in universal design, that is the first step. When we're designing lessons that have a UDL focus, we're thinking about how to engage our learners in that motivation, in that affective network of the brain, which really translates into that limbic area. The cool thing about UDL is learning is then moved, once we get our kids hooked, we start giving them information. And that's kind of typically more of the back of the brain, kind of recognition network. This is where we're inputting knowledge. So we get them excited, get them hooked, get them interested in what we're teaching, and then we give them the information. But real learning, folks, really happens when we ask students to do. So when we give them the knowledge, we get them hooked, we give them the knowledge, and then we ask them to do something. And that all is in the frontal cortex of our brain. So the front part of our neocortex is we call it the strategic network in UDL. And that is the space in the brain where we're actually acting, planning, doing, if you will. So I kind of wanted to take you through the progression of learning, building knowledge through neurons, connectomes, and then the learning process to show you what's happening when our students are experiencing stress. So when we perceive stress of any type, we automatically, that RAS feature in our reptilian brain alerts all of the organs in our limbic brain. And the brain doesn't have this like infinite amount of energy, right? It only has a certain amount of energy. And when that reptilian and that limbic brain are working in conjunction to perceive threat or stress, there is not a lot of energy going to thinking and learning in the neocortex, right? Because what we're trying to do right now, we're just caught in this cycle of hormones and chemical impulses that are telling us that we're not safe or that we're in a threatening way. So there's not really a lot of information that can be taken in the brain.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Please.
Jamie and I were talking about how we've had this experience, even as adult learners, when we have had our own trauma in our lives. And I know that I was recalling for Jamie a period of time where I was kind of stuck in a complicated grief cycle, I think. And I had the very distinct memory of people talking to me and thinking to myself, oh my God, shut up. Oh my God, if I could just disappear right now, please stop talking, please stop talking. And I was thinking about students that we've all had, that you see them and they pull their sweatshirt over their head and they're down. And it's like, you wonder, like, I mean, I know people in this room don't wonder. We've moved past, are they being defiant? Because we know that's not the case. And all of you know that's not the case. But we know that this is what they're doing, right? They're stuck in some sort of re-experiencing or some sort of limbic reptilian moment. And they're thinking about us. Oh my God, shut up. I'm overwhelmed. My resources are overwhelmed. I'm not here with you right now. And it is the biggest piece of behavior. And I know Jamie has talked to me about that just since the campfire of having that experience herself. So it built great empathy on our part for just students,
And what's really cool about that, to kind of piggyback on what Rebecca shared, is that for somebody like me with PTSD, or even our students with just complex trauma or intergenerational trauma, when I learned this about myself, it helped me to understand that, like, this is a circuitry problem, right? So something in my reptilian brain, even though I'm safe, is alerting me to not feel safe. Like there's imminent, in my case, it was always precipitated by fire. That's kind of my trigger, if you will. And so maybe unknowingly, not a lot of control that I have over it, is that RAS, that scanning feature, has somehow perceived threat. And for someone with PTSD, that's kind of the thing that's broken. It's just constantly perceiving threat. But it's also activating all of these organisms here that are sending bad hormones or stress hormones into my brain. And then remember I said that hippocampus, it stores our memory. So then it's activating this hippocampus wherein I'm recalling, and now I'm in the space where I'm driving out through the flames again, even though I'm sitting in my office or standing in my class or sitting in my car. My brain is taking me to that space unknowingly. And so for a student or somebody who's struggling with that kind of level of trauma, that's really intense, and important for educators to understand that in those moments, there's not a lot of learning or teaching that can go on.
Unless you make space, right, to deal with the limbic and the reptilian. So, I'm thinking too of experiences I've had where I didn't have a specific trigger, but those parts of my brain that were more connected to survival or processing difficult emotion, were just overwhelmed. So just at random moments, I'd have that experience of being kind of flooded and not being able to take in one more thing. And I think that our students have that all the time.
And like I said, it's important to understand this because we have to, as educators, cultivate a culture of support. And so I love this quote by Maya Angelou. She has this quote that says, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. So I just took you through what's happening in the brain and why stress impacts teaching and learning. So because we're all in the business of teaching and learning, it only makes sense that now that we know that, we have an action plan for doing something about it. So, cultivating a culture of support is really important. And this can look like a lot of things in a school. And we're all really familiar with the MTS model. One of the things I love about this model is that flexibility, that fluidity of moving a student along that continuum to make sure that they have the individual supports that they need. And today, what we really wanted you to take away from our presentation was really some strategies and supports at that tier 1 and tier 2 level. So tier 1 today, we're going to talk about some healing-centered teaching practices for the classroom, things that teachers can do kind of on a large scale. And then for tier 2, we're going to talk a little bit more about supporting students who are actually in crisis or students at risk. What I'm really excited about tier 3, and my husband, John, is the vice principal at Fairview High School. And if you want to see a culture of support for trauma or healing centered practices, take a tour, call them up. I'm sure they'll allow you to take a tour. Hope that's not unsolicited. But anyways, I only say that because what they are doing to support their students is amazing. They bring a lot of tier 3 supports, which are therapeutic supports that are individualized, specific to a student or their situation. And that's not always available on all campuses, just funding and other things like that. But what I will tell you is in June, as part of the ACEs initiative, there is going to be some money through the California Comeback Plan that is going to go to behavioral health services directly affiliated with schools. And so keep an eye on that. If you don't have a lot of tier 3 services at your site, know that there's funding coming. There are programs that can that we're starting to really look at this, and hopefully that's good news for everybody. But like I said, today's learning goals are for you to just leave here with some tier 1 and tier 2 supports. So with that being said, I always like to start with the tier 1 universal interventions. I believe that these are proactive interventions that are best implemented within the classroom and monitored in the classroom as well. And I think for me, I also teach the behavior management course at CSU Chico, and I was already talking about restorative practices and social emotional learning prior to my experience with the campfire, or like in the first 10 weeks of my class. And so, and what I've learned now is only like kind of really strengthened my conviction to really supporting those practices. So personally and professionally, I think the biggest bang for your buck is to integrate social emotional learning. And let me give you some stats. So social emotional learning, there's been a ton of research on it. These are like the idea of developing competencies within our students so that they can navigate social situations, because what we know is that students aren't exactly born with these skills. We have to teach them, and we kind of have to take responsibility for that in the classroom. I think we're kind of at that place where we need to really embed this into our curriculum, because we technically are building humans, so we should build them well. But let me give you some stats on social emotional learning. So there were 2 big studies. One was like a collection of 213 different research studies that involved nearly 300,000 students and that were participating in social emotional learning programs. So some type of programming or curriculum on the campus. And what they found was that there was improved classroom behavior and increased ability to manage stress and depression, and that the students had better attitudes about themselves, their peers, and the school. So big bang for the buck on that. That study was later followed up fairly recently in like 2017, I think. And it looked at an additional 100,000 students and kind of followed them long term. And what they found is that up to 18 years later, students who were engaged in social emotional learning through programming or curriculum or whatever the case may be, tend to have long-term positive effects that included a favorable impact on their social relationships, increased graduation rates for high school, and also increased college attendance rates. So that was really cool. But that's not even the coolest stat. The biggest piece, I think the biggest bang, the most impact, was a study that was done. It wasn't really a study, it was more like a cost benefit analysis if we want to get super granular, but it was done in 2015. And they found that for every dollar kind of like put into the programming or implementation of a social emotional learning program on a school, there was a return of $11 on that investment. So it's big money. Where I'm from in Vegas, I would definitely play those odds 100% at a time. So if you want to know more about, I'm not kind of a poster child for social emotional learning. That's not my bag. I just think it's a really good practice to embed not only in your classroom, but like maybe your district or school. You can learn more at CASEL, or the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning. And the reason I love CASEL is because they're not only hip to social emotional learning, but they're hip to staying current in the research and social justice movements. So for example, they recently redefined their definition of social emotional learning to be more inclusive of all learners, which was great. They are doing a lot of work on transformative SEL, which is like a component of SEL that really takes into consideration the intergenerational healing of some of our more marginalized groups, which I think is absolutely perfectly timed. And then they're also developing a building equitable learning environments, or the BELL framework, which focuses on the inclusive and restorative redesign of learning spaces post 2020. So another like really relevant, really on top of it, cutting edge work for CASEL. But there are other classroom considerations aside from social emotional learning, and a lot of them align to a lot of the practices of social emotional learning. But within the classroom, some high leverage things that you can do is focusing on relationships and community. On the link here and in our slides that we'll share out, and we'll give you some resources. We have this little continuum on relationships. Did somebody jump in?
I think so.
You have a question?
Maybe not.
Maybe
Okay.
an unmuter.
Yeah,
No big
maybe.
deal. All right. And then the one thing that I like to do even at the college level is collaboratively setting classroom norms, right? You're not the like leader of the world as a teacher. We kind of want to build this idea of democracy and collaboration. So I believe that norm setting is a really good way to do that. Again, an SEL practice. I am a firm believer on practicing mindfulness and gratitude. I'm in a training last week and this week, and we open every day with a mindful minute. And so just a minute to where we call attention to something, we get our brains focused on the learning at hand, and we are just better able to get to the work that we need to do when we add that into our routine. And then gratitude too, something as simple as just like getting your kids to take a minute and list 3 things that they're grateful for. And it could be low-hanging fruit, like Rebecca says, I love that. But anything, it just gets the mind, it gets that limbic part of the brain focusing on sending those good hormones so that we can really get into that. When we think about that, these are very easy things to do. Take a minute of your time in your routine and have big impacts, big outcomes. Another thing is to capitalize on your students' assets and strengths, provide choice and support autonomy. All 4 of these things are essentially tenets of universal design for learning. So if you're not embedding UDL in your practice, start doing it. Email me, I'd be happy to tell you more. And then we're also hearing a lot of restorative practices. And I think this is really an answer to some very long unanswered questions about discipline and what is punishment and what is practical and healthy. And so I love a lot of these restorative practices also align to social emotional learning. And I went ahead and linked a little document that for each of the different practices that tells you how it aligns to social emotional learning. So again, if you're embedding social emotional learning and restorative practices in your work, you're really getting a big bang for your buck. Some of my favorite things are effective statements. I think these are not only great for the classroom, but they're great for life. So if you learn how to talk in effective language, you'll just be, I just feel like you get your point across a little bit better. You get people to understand where you're coming from, and you move forward after conflict a little easier. Restorative circles, totally believe in that. And then also restorative conferences. So this idea that we're giving kids an opportunity to practice their social emotional learning skills, to conflict or to resolve conflict, to talk things out with peers, so that when they're in their adult life, these things, if these situations come up, they have some skills that they can draw upon to kind of move themselves forward in a very acceptable social way.
And I just want to say, we're going to get you talking in just a minute.
Yeah.
Just a minute about the things that you do and the things that you wish to do. So
those are essentially were tier 1 kind of practices, things that we could all do in our classrooms to support all learners. Tier 2, this kind of, we wanted to really focus on the students who are either at risk. Maybe you know a little bit about the stress that they're experiencing in their environments, whether it's at the school or in their home life. But we also wanted to give you some tools for that kid that's standing in front of you in absolute crisis. And sometimes we're the people that kids pick, right? We're the people that they want to talk to. They want to open up to us. And sometimes we're not well equipped to know exactly what to do or what to say. So I wanted to just provide some tools, some supports that can help teachers to at least, kind of know what to do in those moments and not just be standing there like, I don't know what to do with this trauma and this student in crisis. So some of the things that actually work for me, grounding techniques, this idea that, grounding techniques for me, I just kind of start to look at the things that are in my environment and just start naming them. I see a phone, I see a chair, I see a door, I see a brown wall. What that does is helps me anchor into my present moment. And it helps students to kind of move from this limbic area of the brain into kind of calming and recognizing things in their environment to get them into that neocortex. Another thing that works for me and has worked for some of my students is this deep breathing. I like box breathing. Box breathing, you take an inhale for 4 seconds, hold it, let it out for 4 seconds, and then hold it. And you don't have to just be in crisis to use these techniques. I use them constantly in my life. Another thing, and I will say probably the most important thing as a student or a person in crisis myself, was that immediate connection to resources. So if you have a student in crisis standing in front of you, number one, you want to get them calm or as calm as they can be. So grounding techniques and breathing, that tends to help. But you also want to connect them immediately to resources. And that may look different for your campus. At Chico State, luckily we had the Crisis Hotline, and that was able to facilitate future connections for me. And then I love this idea of checking in or following up once this stress is or the crisis is neutralized, when you're bringing students back into the environment, and you'll have to kind of play this by ear depending on the situation and the comfortability of the student. But you could use a restorative practice like a reintegration circle to kind of allow that student an opportunity to maybe share if they wanted to, and get the other students to kind of provide support. I know that after the campfire, we had an SOE meeting, and in that meeting, it was right after the fire, and I was able to address the staff and say, this was really difficult for me, I'm hurting. And it was just very helpful for me to kind of call that out so that my colleagues knew what was going on and could support me in that way. And then I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, because she has the best quote of all time for supporting students in crisis.
Well, I don't know about that, but yeah, sometimes I think that it's valuable to, because trauma is complex, and the time course is uncertain, and there's not a silver bullet, right? There's no easy fix, and you all know this. It takes a lot of time and a lot of trust and relationships and working through. Just making the space to say, I see you, I see that you're struggling, I hear you, I understand that something is wrong, and I'll be here with you through it. Because a lot of our students don't have, some of them do, but a lot of them don't have somebody who will just recognize it for what it is and be there with them through it. And they're kind of stumbling around in the dark, not knowing what's happening. And I see that a lot with people in trauma. They just aren't really able to name it or to recognize what it is. And I think that's hugely life-giving to know this is what's going on, and somebody else has a little bit more of a roadmap of this than I do, and they're going to be here with me. And I think that's huge, and it goes a long way to establishing a relationship. And just the fact that somebody notices that the student and their behavior, checks in with them, is a mirror, is like a sort of a loving mirror for reflecting back to them what I see, builds self-awareness in them. And self-awareness, as it turns out, and when you get outside of these short-term crisis management strategies, is a huge of huge importance in overcoming or metabolizing trauma long-term and breaking patterns of re-traumatization or repeating the experience in other ways that are novel, is that self-awareness. So helping students to build self-awareness really early in their school careers and very close to the events that they're experiencing, instead of letting a lot of time go by, is huge. And it just shows students that you care. So I think that it's not fancy, and it's not a bell or a whistle or a really cool strategy. It's really old stuff. It's really old school stuff. I'm making space, I'm being here, you can trust me, and I see you, and I see what's going on, and I'm gonna hang with you through this process. I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, and all of these proactive strategies really could align to some of the strategies we shared with you for healing-centered classrooms. And I think it's really important that educators, specifically, like Rebecca said, if you can model self-awareness and regulation as you're teaching, checking in with your students and saying, like, this is the first lesson I've ever taught this way. I'm feeling a little nervous. Could you just help me by taking a deep breath with me? Those are things that are small, but it models that you are human. You build connections with students when you model that vulnerability. And then you're also showing them, here's how I'm metabolizing it. Here's how I'm making space. I'm taking a breath. Would you like to join me in that? So there's little things that you can do that are proactive ways to really support those students who are in crisis.
And you all know, just providing a calm and positive environment is sometimes a huge asset at a school site.
And remember,
Or in
I
your
always tell
classroom.
my students that like you are responsible for the weather in your classroom, so make it sunny.
Mhm.
But we want to get you guys kind of
Or make it stable.
Yeah, make it stable. Yeah. We want to get you guys connecting with one another. And so what we're going to do in this moment is we're going to give you an opportunity to think about the resources that we shared with you, digest the MTS model for cultivating culture of support. And we're going to break you into 20 breakout groups. So there'll be about 10 people in each breakout group. And what I would like for you to do is there's a link here that I'll put in the chat in just a second. Oh, I'll go ahead and do that now. So there's a link that I will put in the chat, and in your breakout rooms, when we say go, we're going to give you about 15 minutes to work with your cohorts on identifying some of the practices at the different tiers. And so specifically at the tier 1 and tier 2 level, if you have some tier 3 supports, that's great. We would like to hear about those too. What I can tell you is, I'll go ahead and click on.
And can I clarify practices that you have in place or practices that you'd like to put in place at your school site?
So how this is going to work is, like I said, you're going to all be in breakout groups and we're just going to randomly assign. So there are 20 slides. And once you're assigned a breakout group, you'll be in like group 7, then you'll know that you're going to be working on slide 7. And so the idea here is that you collaborate with other people in different schools and different districts to understand what they're doing to support their students across this model. And then you just go ahead and click on the different text boxes and just type in your notes. And then we'll come back and do a little debriefing together. Is everybody clear on the directions?
Are there any questions?
Yeah, we'll start with that.
MTSS for trauma supports in your schools, basically.
Okay. If you have a question, just feel free to unmute and yell it out. But whoever is doing breakout rooms, if you could go ahead and let the folks into their breakout rooms.
All right, breakout rooms are opening.
Thank you.
We'll do some sharing out afterwards.
Yeah, I'll jump into a breakout in just a sec, but Kevin, I didn't see your DM at first, but Jamie, the question keeps coming up of if there are any tools to measure resilience out there.
What's that?
There was a question in the chat box that come up a couple of times about, are there tools to measure resilience?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll have Rebecca talk about that. Sorry, I wasn't really watching the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, it's no big deal. It's just Kevin asked me that in a DM and I didn't see it, so I was just addressing it before I joined.
Dave, do you need some help?
Yeah, is my breakout room the one I usually go to, Kubeki and?
Huh, good question. They're supposed to be random, which means that you were just gonna.
Okay, I'll go back to it. That's fine, I'll go back to the room. I wasn't sure if we were supposed to be.
You missed your team so much.
I know, it's sad. All right, thanks, guys.
Sure.
Yeah. We're gonna kind of hear from everybody first, and then we'll come back to that question a little bit. And we've looked at some different curriculum or pieces of curriculum for different aspects, so we'll hang on to that, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Okay. I think most people are back, and we really want to hear from you. We know we've been talking at you quite a bit, and so we want to just hear some of the things that you came up with that you think were really exceptional practices that you either have in place or would love to put in place. And actually, I'm sorry, before people get started, we keep getting a question about measuring resilience. And so I just want to give a shout out to a couple measures. I'll tell you that for a while, there were like 2 measures for like 15 years, and now there's a lot of them. And so I have experience with some of them and not all of them. So, you know, I'm going to give you the names of some that I've used. So the Child and Youth Resilience Measure came out in 2008, and that's a pretty good one because it looks at children and adolescents. There's a really simple resiliency quiz that came out in 2007. It's called the Resiliency Quiz. It's a shorter form. There's Childhood Trauma Questionnaire. That's pretty good. And then there's a Post-Traumatic Growth Inventory by Tedeschi and Calhoun that we're going to get to post-traumatic growth in a minute, that are good. But there are literally probably 30 scales right now. And I've read studies that use a lot of them. I'm not sure that one is favored over another. Now, the Child and Youth Resilience Measure is quite good, and it's cited a lot, but so just putting that out there, and we can revisit that at the end if you want. Okay, so we want to hear from you. What are some of your tier 3 classroom practices that?
Let's do tier 1 first.
Oh, tier 1?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
sure, go for it. So I guess we're going tier 1.
Yeah, bottom up.
Oh, did I say tier? Oh, I meant.
I already get it confused.
I
all the
meant
time.
tier
It's
1.
cool.
I
It's
meant
fine.
tier 1, classroom-based practices.
Foundational
Classroom-based
Yeah.
practices. So jump in, put your hand up if you have that feature in your reactions.
Erin.
At my school, one of my favorite teacher friends, she has each student start the day by doing a digital check-in, which is very brief, but it allows her the opportunity, or it allows the kids the opportunity to let her know if they didn't sleep last night, if they didn't have food, if somebody didn't come home or whatever. So it makes it easy for her to check in with her, 80 some odd 7th and 8th graders as to if they need some follow-up at break time. I think it's a great strategy for that age group and provides a lot of pertinent information and doesn't take up a lot of time.
It's great. And I've also seen folks who open the day with a quick one thing you're grateful for as well, layering in something there gives you kind of a sense. Ryan Franco.
Hi everyone. Yeah, so our school, as we strive to incorporate restorative practices and SEL curriculum, we start each day out with what we call community circles, which are basically like a restorative circle, and we start with the temp check on a scale from 1 to 10 to try to see how every kid is feeling that day, kind of before we start asking questions. The cool thing is the questions we formulate allow us to focus on certain parts of SEL in a kind of a clever way and allow everyone to kind of reflect on that. So we start every single day with that activity. So that's definitely a universal thing we do for all students.
It's great.
That's so awesome.
It's great. Those personal check-ins.
Thank you, Ryan.
And thank you for the person who said that. That's why I was
we'll
confused because the slide deck has got the tiers flipped.
Somebody thought of a literal temp check because of COVID. That's hilarious. And that's where we are in 2021. Awesome.
Other things, emotional temperature checks, literal temperature checks. Okay. Some good for well-being, some not so much.
There's an example of a digital check-in in the chat.
Great.
All right. Other
tier 1.
Tier 1, we at the elementary levels in Chico Unified, we do have classroom lessons on just social emotional feelings, those kinds of things. So those are pretty universal throughout the classroom elementary level ages.
Great.
I teach at Hamilton Elementary in the middle school, and next year, one of the things that we're going to be helping our general ed teachers with is providing each classroom with a box that has a variety of calming tools like cushioned seats and bands for the chairs and different fidgets. And then teachers will set up a location in the classroom that kids can kind of either through prompting or just through their own regulation be able to go over and access those throughout the day.
That's great. That's great. Instead of trying to spend all of your energy containing behaviors, give them the freedom to address their needs. Yeah.
I like it. Teaches a lot about autonomy and self-regulation as well. All right, other really great ideas. Yes.
This year I teach junior high, but last year I was third grade for a while and I got a Donors Choose project, which was a tent. It was like the calming tent where you could go in I think it was mermaids or something. I don't remember, but the kids would go in and they would read or just calm down, and it was really fun. So calming tent.
Yeah. Interesting. That's great.
Can we get that for the SOE?
I'm pretty sure. Pretty sure we need a calming tent
For me. Research to support
just for
it.
me.
Yeah. Other ideas.
Other ideas.
I did share this with my group. I said that I used to have a classroom, or a part of the classroom we called the ocean, and everybody wants to go to the ocean. It was a calming and relaxing place, and teacher didn't bug the kids when they went to the ocean, and the kids didn't bug the teacher when he went to the ocean. Yeah. And it was a place where I just need to get away, leave me alone, give me a few minutes. I'm just gonna go hang out at the ocean. And that was the corner of the classroom, and there were just those items in that classroom, an ED classroom, to just calm down kids. And when they were ready to come back, hey, we're ready to have you back.
That's the metaphorical ocean. And if you're from Humboldt, you have a literal ocean pretty close to you too, right? I don't know if you're from Humboldt, but yeah, some of you are.
We have a couple of ideas in the chat that I'll read. Children's lit SEL books, choice tickets and play, choice time. And another person, Jenny, posted calmingroom.scusd.edu. She had that in her Google Classroom and modeled how it could be used. Very useful. And then Dr. Gold-Branson wanted to chime in.
Go ahead, Dr. Gold-Branson.
I didn't know I wanted to chime in. I just said I have a calming tent.
I thought you had like something to say.
No, I was just saying I have one when you're talking about you said we needed a calming tent. That was it. Sorry.
Well, bring it to work.
Do any of you have more of a general approach in your tier one instead of like a particular activity or strategy, but an environment or a tone that you strive to set up in your classroom that you feel would facilitate being healing centered or trauma sensitive or informed?
I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but I'm starting some research on teaching SEL through literature and whether or not that impacts resilience, and we're starting it at Paradise High. But that's why I was asking for the measures. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And I think a simple search too will yield some studies that have done that. Check out Angela Duckworth actually has done some studies of using literature and seeing if it influences some of those qualities.
Thank you. I found a couple, but not Duckworth. So I'll look for that.
Yeah.
And we have, Jenny has her hand raised, but before I ask her to unmute and share, I want to just read a few things from the chat. Some things that people are using are great SEL resources on Newsella. I love Newsella, more for the older students, I guess. Movement breaks, I think that's really important. A teacher mailbox where students can share private messages of things weighing on them. A lot of people like that idea. Purposeful people weekly lessons in all classes by the counselor in Gridley. I think that's really cool. Getting some of your counseling staff involved in this process, I think, is really important. And I'll read the next few, but before I do, I wanted to allow Jenny to unmute and share her idea.
Not in this last year, but the years past, I my room had alternative seating throughout the whole room. Kids could choose to sit at tables if they wanted to, but then I had, carpet spaces, individual, what we call cave seats, where they could sit under the table if they felt like they needed a little bit of a space away from other people. And they were strategically placed in class so that they could see me in the front. And then also I'm first grade, by the way, so it's a little bit different, but my kids take their shoes off when they come into the classroom. So they're a little bit more comfortable. They're not feeling like, because the first thing they do is they go home is they kick their shoes off. And so we have a no shoe policy. So they either have a pair of slippers that they wear in class, or they just have to have socks on. And we have a big basket if they forget their socks, but the kids tend to just kind of calm themselves down when they don't have to have their shoes on. It's just more of a cozy atmosphere, lots of rug space. And it really helps with their sense of home instead of just like, I'm in class.
Post-COVID, I'm pretty sure we're wearing yoga pants for the first semester back.
Yeah. A couple more great ideas from the chat. Cal Global Ed has a great SEL book list connected to the SEL competencies. So Kendra went ahead and linked that for everybody in the chat. Kevin's school put an advisory period into their schedule, which is a check-in, an SEL period outside the academic day, and they have SEL lessons, academic supports, and discussions.
I always want to build on that, a period for SEL outside the academic day, because I always get that feedback, and I get it in the SOE a lot, where people will say, why don't we have a course that teaches us about some of this content? Like, we know there's a huge relationship between thinking styles and cognitive flexibility and the ability to be more adaptable and flexible in our thinking, which makes us more resilient and, a buffer against trauma and all that. And it's the teacher ed curriculum is so packed, and your curriculum is so packed with all of the standards and things, but there is so much. I've literally mapped it out a couple times, or I could fill up a couple classes. So I love people making the time to do that. I think it's critical. There's so many skills and techniques and concepts that can be taught in those classes.
Another question that we had right before we wanted to break out and hear from you folks was regarding different curriculums. And so in the chat, and I was kind of hoping this would happen where we would all learn from one another, because there's many curriculums out there. But in the chat, we have a lot of love for Inner Explorer, the Mind Up curriculum.
I've used one.
There's some additional reading resources, Reading with Relevance, encompassing SEL with novels in ELA and reading classes. And then I'm just trying to make sure I kind of click all the, get all the,
right.
And then it looks like Laura Manning shared Dan St. Romain for connecting, check out Dan St. Romain for connecting SEL to literature for younger children. He is in Texas. He has spoken at several California kindergarten events. That's another one to check out. And there's so many ideas. I can't seem to, zones of regulation, that's a really cool tool. My Fairview High School, I know, is using that. My husband has been teaching me a lot about that, and I'm all about that. That's really cool stuff. Rethinked is another one, but there's tons. So you really just need to find what works for your school, what works for your classroom, what works for your students, and what works for you as an educator. But I will encourage everybody to just jump in the chat and look at all the great ideas and resources that your fellow educators or fellow colleagues have provided, because they far surpass the ones that we shared with you today. So I'm so excited to see you guys extend that knowledge.
And how about tier 2?
Yeah, let's jump into
tier 2.
Why try is another one.
Why try, yeah.
Morning meetings. All right, so what are we doing to support students in crisis?
I know there's many of you that I see who have experience with students in crisis. Share a bit with us.
I can share.
Yeah.
I think one thing we do before it gets what I call too late, be it dropping out, full on, but we do student study team meetings. They're totally not punitive, but we have caseloads at our school. It's Hearthstone K through 12. I teach high school. And if we see patterns, especially even more so during COVID, of non-attendance or just apathy, depression, getting an a peek into what the home environment is really like, that's a whole book. Then we will call the student in, and I notice, I don't know how it works for elementary, but for high school, surprisingly enough, the attention is really welcomed by students. You get a chance to individuate and build a relationship. They see that you're showing up for them. And, academics are a part of it, but it is an opportunity to talk to the student about, the obstacles that are that have been created either through the Zoom meeting place or just with the work in general. So the student study team is documented in areas, and we take notes, and then hopefully, not always, do follow-ups. And if something rears up that's, a red flag, we look for resources there too. But it usually is like an administrator, counselor, and then a teacher on their caseload. And we have supervising groups, supervising teachers. So in most schools, it would just be the counselor. But I think that even the hour that's spent doing that, and then the student sees visibility as a positive, there's nothing that's, nothing happens to them. It's not a referral. It's
in fact, something good might happen to them.
Yeah. It's just and if we have to have another one, we do. But as I said before, what I've noticed in high school for most of the students is that they appreciate it.
Right.
It's the time, and then they appreciate the check-in later. And then again, some things are just revealed in a smaller group setting that won't happen even online in a technological questionnaire. Some people just really the kids need to have that voice.
Right.
So that's what we do.
Thank you. We saw a couple people in the chat. We're talking about a Zen Den.
We have one of those at the university.
Calming room. We have one at the university that we've been known to avail ourselves of. So place to go and just kind of.
At our school in Plymouth County PUSD, we use the toolbox. It's 12 tools, and what is really cool about it is they each have emotions. So for the little kids, breathing, they kind of do a little hand motion as they breathe. Quiet, safe place. There is another little motion. I love the one about I let the little things go, like the garbage can. And
I love that. Letting things go.
And kids know those cues. At the balancing, like I care for myself, I care for others. So there's a short sentence, and then and I do have to say, as an adult, it has helped me over time as well. And it's just like that common language and the gesture that comes with it. So the toolbox, if you look it up.
Yeah, I love that. Balancing and letting things go, which is so hard for adults, right? Starting when they're young, helping them to start doing that. That's great.
I think the important thing, we're going to have to transition, but this is such a great conversation. And I really believe that opportunities like this, where we can hear from other people who are doing the very same work that we're doing, are really great because we can kind of share those ideas. So like I said, check out the chat. There's so many great ideas here, and hopefully you guys have good connections with each other so you guys can understand what each school is doing to kind of help students metabolize their stress and trauma.
And I know this is the last thing I'll say, just as another plug for individual curriculum or classes or devoted time to social emotional learning or other aspects of well-being. Marty Seligman always talks about PERMA as sort of an acronym, where he talks about focusing on positive emotion and flow states and meaning in life and all of the things that we kind of don't teach in school that are really important to kids' actual success and happiness in life. And the A in his acronym PERMA is accomplishment. And through a variety of studies, he's found that when we do take the time to focus on well-being and emotion and health, that accomplishment actually goes up. And so that's our whole goal, right? Is accomplishment. We spend all our time on accomplishment without thinking about well-being. And it's like, it seems silly that we don't give it its fair due, because it seems to be a difference that makes a difference. So just my shameless plug for some sort of devoted curriculum, and us included, the SOE. I mean, we really need it. We need a class that focuses almost entirely on this content.
So we are going to transition back. Thank you so much for everybody who provided ideas, and thank you for taking the time to work in your groups and work on those slides. We'll make sure that you guys have access to that work as well, so you can see all of the other groups' ideas. But we're going to take it back into our, hold on, sorry, let me share screen. Here we go. All right, so let's take it back. Why can't I? Oh, that's fine. Okay. All right, so you guys got to turn.
Okay. So, so we talked about teaching and learning, and we just want to talk about you for a moment and the impacts of stress and working with students who are in crisis or who are dealing with chronic stress on you. And this is often called secondary trauma. And we had Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, who was one of the first people who wrote about this in her book, Trauma Stewardship, come right after the fire. And she spoke to a pretty large audience of community members and teachers just about trauma in general. But she really pivoted on this secondary trauma and it's sort of warning signs that you're having a trauma exposure response. So like compassion fatigue or burnout or whatever label you want to give it, but it's you feeling some of these things because you're dealing with students feeling these things. And so this is a list of 16 very uplifting categories of warning signs. And I say that tongue in cheek, obviously. And you can read the list, but there's some things that you'll recognize on this list. And me particularly, I'll just share at the end of the semester, this semester, I was feeling a lot of them because it had been a particularly demanding year. So chronic exhaustion and physical ailments. I did our end of the year retreat with my camera muted because I had one eye that was having an autoimmune response, right? Definitely a sign of exhaustion. Hypervigilance, that thing that we feel really guilty about when we are unable to empathize with other people. You know, if you've ever had the experience of a student come up to you and say, Mr. McKay, I'm picking on Dave because I know he's never had this feeling probably, but Mr. McKay, listen, I have something great to tell you. And he's thinking, stop talking. I don't have any, I'm full, right? I'm just picking on you, Dave, because I know he has great capacity, but you know, we've all had that feeling or just feeling sort of cynical about our jobs or like, I can never do enough. I'm not giving enough. Those feelings are a sign that you're there. You need to start taking care of yourself. And so without belaboring all of the excitement on this slide, we're going to kind of move on to thinking about your own self-care routine. And it sounds just absolutely simple. And it's actually a really hard thing. All of us probably struggle with this. There's probably a few of you who are great at it, but we just like this Maya Angelou slide. I don't trust people who don't love themselves and tell me I love you. There's an African saying, which is be careful when a naked person offers you a shirt, right? If somebody can't give you what they don't have, it's the old, you know, secure your mask before helping other passengers kind of thing. You really gotta live it and do it yourself to give back. And so it's really, really clear in the research that it's important and that it makes a difference.
So some of the things that I learned in my recovery from trauma were one of probably the most pivotal things for me was when Dr. Vandernoot-Lipsky came to speak after the campfire, and she talked about this concept of owning your morning. And I have to laugh because my husband is so great at owning his morning. He owns his morning every day, gets up, rides a bike. And when he tries to bring me along in owning my morning, sometimes I want to throw my coffee at him when it's 5:30 and he says, hey, you want to go ride a bike? But what I've learned is that if I just get up and I do, I've started my whole day out positively. I'm even at the very like cellular level with my stress hormones, I'm sending good hormones into that limbic system instead of like the negative ones. And so owning your morning, there's really something to that. And it can look like a lot of things. For my husband and I, that means we get up and we get active. So we're either riding our bikes or we're hitting golf balls or we're one wheeling or we're working out. That's the way that we like to start our morning to kind of put ourselves on a good trajectory for the day. there's, like I said, a lot of ways to do this. Exercise and recreation are probably the biggest keys here. There's so much research that supports that when we are exercising, when we are moving our bodies, everything in our brain is working a little faster, a little better, a little easier. So get that exercise, make sure your body stays strong and healthy so that your mind can stay strong and healthy. And then again, eating healthy. What you put into your body is kind of what you get out of it in terms of performance. So that's a big, it's a big thing that, you know, just a little thing that we can do for ourselves is making sure that we're, you know, stacking our bodies with proper nutrition so that we can make it through these days, especially when they're stressful or a little extra, if you will. Getting a good night's sleep. This was probably the one thing for me that really set me on my trajectory of recovery, was once I was able to get through a night without either insomnia or night terrors, I was able to kind of better take on each and every day. And over time, I learned a lot of tools to help me get to sleep and to stay asleep that, you know, are things that I can use when just little everyday frustrations come up that might keep me awake at night.
You know, can I just say, I'm really surprised how many students how many of our college students tell me that they don't sleep properly. They can't sleep at night. And so I'm guessing your students tell you that as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of research too that meditation and like this can be more spiritual thing. This can be a lot. This can be yoga induced. This can be prayer, whatever meditation means for you. It can mean a lot of different things. But I always kind of liken it to enjoying nature. And it's important to remember that our species did not evolve in big cities, in houses, in schools. We didn't evolve this way. So we were actually kind of come from nature. So something about going back into nature and experiencing nature does something really fundamentally good for the brain. Practicing mindfulness, that's a really great technique. Like I said, being able to bring yourself into the present moment is a skill that it's really a self-care skill, but also a really good social skill, I believe, for those times where you're feeling upset or feeling, I don't know, for lack of a better term, some type of way. Practicing mindfulness and centering yourself is really helpful. And then I have to tell you, it sounds silly. And if you tell a person who's struggling with trauma to practice gratitude as a way to help them get through the trauma, you're probably going to be met with a punch in the face. At least that's where I was when that was brought up to me. But over time, I brought it up. You did. I wanted to punch you in the face. No offense. But over time, seriously, just the little things that you can do to practice gratitude, to be grateful for the things that are in your life, to recognize, even if it's low-hanging fruit, like Rebecca says, just recognizing it does something in the brain that gets those positive chemicals rolling. And so for me, what this looks like is I've now wired myself to wake up, and this is the first thing I do, is just recall 3 things that I'm grateful for. And I try really hard not to make them the same 3 things every day. But I'll grow in my practice over time.
And can I just say really quick what it is doing in the brain is you know, the negativity bias is real. We see and identify and understand everything that is negative as a threat to us. And if you're living in a lot of negativity, you're narrowing your field of vision and your sense of possibilities about what is possible for you. So gratitude opens us up and gets us into optimism. And so optimism has all of these sort of well documented through research benefits of like increased creativity, more engagement, increased productivity. So it's just broadening your field and gets you in kind of a commensurate emotional environment that is positive as well.
Sure. Yeah. And the last thing I will say is the brain is wired to connect to other people. Socially, we are social animals. So there's a lot of research out there that talks about just enjoying time with loved ones and how beneficial that is to the brain. And to be honest with you, in those moments when you're really struggling, you need those connections, you need those relationships to fall back on, somebody to help stand you up when you're kind of like falling down a little bit. And if you don't believe me, when you go back and you tell your principal you need more time for your self-care, you can cite the following research studies that all support the different practices that I just outlined on the slide. And what I'll do is I'm going to go back actually. Sorry. And I want to hear from you really quick. We're going to take about 2 minutes. Yeah. This is another Jamboard, so let me get you that link really quickly. But if you'll just take a moment And if the Jamboard doesn't work, that's okay. We can also use the chat. And if you'll just identify something that you do that helps build your resilience, this can be a self-care practice. It can be a lot of things.
Anything, yeah, anything that's important.
But
to
let's
you.
have you identify that. And I'll go ahead and click up the Jamboard so we can see just how we're all coping and using tools to build resilience. And I'll also open up the chat as well. Oh, I accidentally sent that to, hold on. Sorry, you're waiting for it in the chat. Here's the Jamboard. I realized I sent it to a direct person. So here it is to everybody. Oh God, that's not it. Way to go, Jamboard. There we go. All right, now you can log in and add yourself. Running early every morning are some things that are popping up in the chat. Time outside and exercise. Now you have some research to support that. We have meditation and yoga, listening to podcasts.
Yeah.
Therapy. I'm a believer in therapy.
Taking baths. I'm a believer in taking baths. Here's a layer on for that.
Cooking and feeding my friends. I'll be your friend.
I was going to say, practice gratitude in the bathtub, bang for your buck. For those of you who don't run in the morning, I'm your evening gal for exercise. My morning has got to be quiet.
Playing the guitar.
Music, love it. Positive self-talk.
Walking dogs, animals.
Counseling.
Big thing.
Counseling does not get enough play. It's good. Drink water.
Yes, that's a big one.
Breathing exercise. Say no. That's fantastic. Say no
Ooh.
with no reason. I
I'm
don't
working
have
on
to
that.
explain to you why I just said no to you.
No, it's a full sentence.
Playing my donkey. I'm going to trust you on that.
Kayaking, cooking meals, journaling. I love journaling.
Having healthy boundaries.
Meditating, exercising, lifting weights, pursuing hobbies,
Fishing,
doodling,
golf.
gardening. That's a big one for 2020.
Lots of walkers here. That's great.
Yeah.
Prayer and journaling. Meditation and yoga, socializing with friends, dogs. Absolutely dogs.
I love it.
Turn off social media.
I love that. I don't have social media, but
happy hour. I feel ya.
I'm also about that life too. Good friendships. Yes, yes, yes. Awesome.
Great. Good stuff.
That's great. Thank you so much for taking the time to kind of share what you're using to build your resilience.
Your self-care routine builds your resilience. So connection there.
And we will pick up with the real fun of this
presentation. So we just want to talk for a moment about post-traumatic growth, which is a concept that we probably don't talk about enough. I've had a lot of people tell me since we've had high ACEs scores in our county and in the state of California for a while, and we've talked a lot about that. And so we've upped our game on the conversation around trauma. And then we had the campfire and COVID. And so we've really talked about trauma. And I've had colleagues say, I'm sick of talking about trauma. Let's talk about solutions. Let's talk about the other side of trauma. And I always have mixed feelings about that because one, you can't force the time course and you have to deal with trauma or you don't get to growth. You can't really fast track that, but it is possible to get stuck there too, if you don't do the right things. And so I think it's a delicate blend between giving trauma its respect and then coming in with some of these tools and strategies we've just talked about in the tier 1s and 2s. I'm sorry. Yes, 1s and 2s.
Tiers.
The tiers, 1s and 2s, the base in the middle.
Yeah.
And try to, and the top tier actually, trying to provide a remedy for trauma. So I think that is those things are really important. But on the other side of it, and sometimes at the same time you're still dealing with the trauma, post-traumatic growth is possible. And it's a term that was coined by Tedeschi and Calhoun in 1995, and it's referring to positive changes